We are in the midst of a fascinating discussion of the subtle gradations or bodies of our being through which the worlds of the vital and even mental and indirectly the spiritual impinge upon us. Sri Aurobindo had raised 3 questions. First, he says, why are we not normally aware of so much that is behind us and always pressing upon us? This is in relation to the whole vital worlds. And he says it is for the same reason that we are not aware of the inner life of our neighbors, even though constantly we are impacted by the thoughts, emotions of our fellow men and from the collective mind of humanity. And third, he says it is for the same reason that we are not aware of the greater part of our own being, which is subconscient or subliminal to us. And the reason for all 3 is twofold. First, because normally we use only our corporeal senses, that is the physical, biological organs of senses, which are only concentrated upon the material gradation of the full spectrum of reality. And the second reason, he says, is because we live in the physical body and the physical vitality and the physical mind. That is, in the physical body, the quantum of life force that is organized in its evolution, and the quantum of mental awareness which is developed in the physical biological evolution embedded in the body. And it is not through these that the things of the vital world or the inner life of others or our own deeper ranges connect to us. And then we are in this passage where he says the actual connection points, the entry points of these influences are through other sheaths of our being, other bodies. And then the text we read last time, the mental sheath or subtle body in which our true mental being lives, and the vital sheath or vital body which is more closely connected with our physical or food sheath and forms with it the gross body of our complex existence. So in this very simple sentence, which we dwelt upon pretty much the whole of last time, we found a rich, complex knowledge that is held. But there is also a very clear vocabulary. Our being is the term he uses to include all these sheets together. This is done through other sheets of our being, except that we are normally aware only of our physical body and its life and mind. We are not aware of our larger being, which includes these other sheets. Then he is using a vocabulary that covers 3 sheets: mental sheath, manomaya kosha; life sheath or vital sheath, vital body, which is the pranamaya kosha; and then the food sheath or physical body, which is the annamaya kosha. So we have 3 sheaths, but these are as if subdivided into 2 zones. The mental sheath is largely, he uses the word subtle body, and he contrasts this with the closely connected vital sheath with the physical sheath, which together form our gross body, the gross body of our complex existence. So there's a subtle body and there's a gross body. The gross body is this where you say, I am conscious, this is my body, except that this is actually composed of the food sheath and the vital sheath closely intertwined. The vital sheath actually bridges the mental as well as the physical, but it is much more closely connected, as he says here, with the food sheath. The full force of the more dense vitality directly impacts our physical body. The mental sheath, being more subtle, does not need to draw on this denser grade of life force. It can do with the subtler range of the life force. So in fact, there is a clear bias. The vital sheath is much more closely embedded with the physical, forming this gross body of our complex existence. And again, with the phrase complex existence, he is pointing out that our existence is not limited even to these three sheaths. There is so much more. In the full picture, which he develops through his writings and then dwells upon in some of his letters, his vocabulary goes like this. There is the physical sheath, there is the vital sheath, mental sheath, broadly creating the gross body and the subtle body, and of course the two are interpenetrating. There is somewhere in between, very close to the physical, the domain which the mother describes as the nervous envelope. And for all three sheaths, there is the inner and the outer part. In the physical body, there is the evolution of the life, which he has described here as the physical, the vital physical, which connects to behind to the larger vital sheath, and he calls this the inner vital. Similarly, behind the mental, the true mental is the phrase he has used here. When he speaks of life, he speaks here of mental sheath or subtle body in which our true mental being lives. That's the inner mind. And the subtle physical is the inner physical. And these, when you speak of the inner, actually open out all the way to the universal on their respective levels. And if that makes it complex enough, within each of these there are interminglings of all three to make finer gradations. And at the center of this, or at the core of the inner, in its most essential poise, is the psychic presence, organizing, individualizing as the psychic being. Below is the subconscious and the inconscient. Above the mind is generally the superconscious, into which are finer gradations of the higher mind, illumined mind, intuitive mind, and so on. Now all this makes for a pretty large, rich, and he says here the word complex existence. In this, at every single instant, all these domains are as if influenced by each other. All these have their influence percolating to our most surface parts. Even when we are completely immersed in a very ordinary activity, those things have their influence spreading into us, of which we may not be conscious. But at their inner layers, there is a registration. There is in fact even an influence which may change our behavior without our realizing it. You are walking somewhere, some part of the inner consciousness senses an upcoming danger, and if it senses that the window of the danger is for a reasonably short time, it awakens in you some impulse of distraction. Suddenly your mind wanders, or something attracts your attention. You stop, you, let's say, explore something, window shopping, and then suddenly the impulse inside you says, okay, now it's safe, and you move on, not realizing that on an inner level something prevented a serious incident or accident from happening by intervening, playing with, toying literally with your surface personality, by nudging it, pushing it, distracting it. At its worst, it can even take the form that you're walking and you suddenly trip and fall on a little stone. And just that is enough to have delayed you sufficiently to avoid a more dangerous incident. And so sometimes they say in a very superficial way, yes, in your little accident, a bigger accident was averted. It's as if the bigger one was reduced to a smaller, and we don't even realize. And behind all these, presiding over all these, is the divine presence, the divine consciousness, which also has its impact, which may intervene in similar ways to protect and guide. And the mother points out that it's only when we have a near miss of an accident that we are thankful to the divine grace and we say, oh, by the grace I was saved, we had a knock but no one was injured, and so on. But she says we don't realize how many more times, how much more often the grace saves us, and so smoothly that we don't even realize there was a danger or an accident could have happened. In fact, if you think about it, if the current paradigm of science were true and that everything was a product of chance, then you could not have had such a rich, complex interdependence of life in a very simple ecological structure of a forest. Everything would be breaking down all the time, precisely because there is a much greater power constantly pushing, holding, bringing back into balance the things which go out of balance, that the entire ecosystem sustains itself. In fact, there is no ecosystem unless there is this presiding consciousness holding it all together. System means everything is somehow bound and held in a harmony. What binds, what holds, what is the thing which is the underlying harmony which can impact everything, influence everything, and knows everything in right relation to everything else. And it's not chance. It is a conscious presence, power, consciousness which has a power, but which has also an underlying sense of unity holding it all together. And if this is true of a larger ecosystem, it is equally true of the entire universe. It is equally true of each microcosm within the macrocosm, and that includes us as a microcosm. So if there were not this thing holding it all together, things would rapidly fall apart. Sri Aurobindo even comments in one of his letters that the presiding presence of what he calls, the vocabulary he uses, is the central being, which is the aspect of the self that presides over your individual journey. That is the central being presiding over, above the head is its center. If the central being did not hold together all these different layers of your personality and all the different parts of consciousness and their impulses, if it didn't hold it together, then we are dysfunctional as human beings. And it is only when it pulls that it compels a kind of a unification or a harmonization which makes the whole thing work as a system, as a unit, a more individualized and formed personality. If it releases that pressure, then the mind starts going its way, the vital goes its way, the physical goes its way, and the sub-parts within your mind, within your vital desires, they pull in different directions. The whole personality gets scattered and spread out, and as I said, dysfunctional. The harmonizing principle is not pulling too strongly. And none of this we are aware of. We live only in this very superficial part of our physical body and the life energy and the little part of the mind which is developed in it. We have the image of the proverbial iceberg. 1/10 is above water, 9/10 is hidden. Well, here it's much more. We might even say 1/100th is what we are conscious of, and the 99% is what we are not aware of, even though it is impacting us. Can we become aware of it? As we will see in the sentence after, yes, we can, and the means. But before that, what is it that links all these? And that's the sentence now. These, meaning these sheets of our being, these, the vital and mental sheets, possess powers, senses, capacities which are always secretly acting in us, are connected with us and impinge upon our physical organs and the plexuses of our physical life and mentality. So, the plexuses relate to the physical life and physical mentality, not to the gross physical body. But these other sheaths impact through the plexuses, impact upon our physical organs. They are acting on these physical organs and through them, or rather they're connected to these organs and they act through them and through the plexuses. Now, a picture he has given, if we dwell on each phrase, you will see there are many important insights here. First, he uses 3 words. These possess powers, senses, capacities, which are always secretly acting in us. And we need to pause. What's the difference? Powers, senses, capacities. You see, in our normal vocabulary, we don't distinguish the meaning of these words. You'll say capacity and power, most likely you would say, you would use in the same sense. Senses, similarly, people say, oh, he has the power of inner sight. No, they're different. So Sri Aurobindo using these 3 words, we have to pause and ask what's the difference. First, power is something which is a distinct operation. And if he says that the power exists, a vital body has a power, mental body has a power, implied is that this power doesn't belong to our physical life, then they have a distinct power which has no correspondence here. Second idea is the senses. So the vital body has its senses by which it perceives, mental body has its senses by which it perceives, which are different from your physical senses. And that's different from powers. And third is capacities. Capacities are the part which is shared. My physical body has a capacity for strength, but my vital body has a greater capacity. So when we speak of greater capacities of the mental or vital body, they are similar to the physical powers but of a much greater order. So let's dwell upon each of these. Starting with the last, capacities are greater in the vital and the mental because they are naturally open to the universal and automatically draw upon something of the universal character. So let's say you are now physically tired, suddenly there's a danger and you are able to run at intense speed. That energy is from the vital sheath's greater capacity of life force. And even I discover in the moment of danger, my body is able to run faster than I could when I try to run at my best. I don't know if you have ever had an experience like this. Or on a variation, in a panic, a child's foot is stuck under the car wheel and its mother in desperation lifts the car to get it freed, and afterwards she is asked to lift again, she cannot. So when you try with your normal force of vitality, you can only do so much, but in that moment of danger or panic, you are able to do enormously more, which you cannot replicate in your normal state. And that is a capacity of the vital body, and it can draw upon its capacity to pull. Similarly, we have all had events in our life where there was some kind of a crisis, where we had to stay up to stand for the situation, and we find we could stay almost without eating or without sleep for an unusually long time without feeling tired. And it's a capacity of the vital which has brought itself forward, infused the physical body. Why are we not able to draw upon these greater capacities normally? Because we do not live in that consciousness, and there is a gap between the vital body and its awareness and capacity and our normal physical vitality, which is the superficial part of vital energy developed in your physical body. And in those moments of crisis, either instinctively we plug in, or something of that influence comes forward and pushes. Sri Aurobindo describes an event based on which he wrote a sonnet later, of how he was riding on the horse carriage. There was a point of contact where there was going to be a major accident, and suddenly, he says, his inner being surges forward, and it is as if himself, but in a larger form, it surges forward, seizes the situation, controls it, modifies it in a way that the accident is averted, and withdraws again. And that thing which came forward was himself, and yet as it withdraws, you are lost to its awareness. It was aware of you, you were not aware of it. There is a variation of this experience which one begins to have in certain practices of deep meditation, where that part of the inner being now begins to wake up more and more, or rather, you begin to wake to it. And then there is a kind of a double awareness. And the relationship is very interesting. The surface personality, which for all these years I think was me, is felt in relation to that almost like a child playing in the sand on the edge of the beach. And then that thing is so much vaster. It is as if part of the ocean, and it has such greater depth, wisdom, maturity. It looks upon the surface personality like a child playing and is waiting. Okay, when will you be ready for your real work? And occasionally it sends nudges, pushes. And this is our inner being, or our true inner being. And it is naturally more closely aligned to the presence of the self. And so there is this double part of which we are not aware, but that's truly us in relation to the surface part, which is the physical personality and surface personality. So normally all of that is hidden behind. It surges forward, seizes on the situation, withdraws as needed. Or it may not be so dramatic. It may simply put nudges and pushes, and that's it. So here Sri Aurobindo is speaking of capacities which are properly belonging in their fullness to those. Again, a capacity of the mental body is, for example, the capacity to do complex, difficult calculations. You're given, the people who do this, you're given a 10-digit number multiplied by a 10-digit number, and the person looks at it and writes down the full answer. Now you can still say an adult could train with some special skill of calculation, but a child of 10 doing it, you can't explain. So you'll say child prodigy, but it's a description, it's not an explanation. How does he do it? Where does he do it in his mind? It's not done by the surface mind. If you ask the person, how did you do it? They say, I can't explain. I just look at it and then I know, and I write what I know. So I know is the surface part of the surface mind, what he has described here as the physical mind, physical mental. And the inner mind, or he has used the phrase here, true mental being lives in this mental sheath. There the capacity is there. It can look at it and do the multiplication as easily as you would do if you were shown multiplication of 6 multiplied by 3. You don't need to sit down and count 6 and then again count 6 and then count 6 and then say, yes, it's 18. You look at 6, you look at 3 and you say, it's 18. Isn't it? 5 multiplied by 5, you look at it, you say, it's 25. How do you know? And someone who is still at a very undeveloped stage, will look at you and say, you're a wizard, you know this. And count another 50 just now in such a fraction of a moment. You say, I didn't count. I just saw 50 and 50, the total is 100, it's obvious. How do you explain to that child that you didn't need to count to make this summation? And now you can push the numbers higher. 1000 plus 1000, it's 2000, right? Did it take you a moment to think even? And for that child, you say, you just counted 1000 and then you counted another 1000 in a fraction of a moment. But that's not how you did it. And exactly the same thing happens in that inner mind. You take this 1,563 multiplied by 1,003,251. What's the answer? You look at it, yes, and you write it out. And you can do complex calculations of this kind because to the inner mind it's obvious. But to the surface mind it's like you must have done such a complex series. No, you didn't. And it is the same thing which can take place in other kinds of analysis. A skilled analyst looks at a situation and says, oh yes, it's heading for this problem. Wait, how did you figure it out? He will say, well, I've been doing it for so many years, I know this is how it works. No, it's not that. There was a perception. And Sri Aurobindo points out that this is not necessarily intuition. The intuitive working is a different order. This can be a very rapid internal working of some part of the consciousness, which knows by familiarity or because of the functioning of the inner mind, which is much more free and large. It sees and it recognizes trends. But it's still mind, it is not intuition. The intuition has a different character. And you would know it because the character of intuitive knowing is an identification with that. I look at the situation and feeling myself in and one with the situation, I can sense it's pulling in this direction and it will lead to this outcome. That's how intuition feels. Whereas the mind is still, I am looking, thinking, the situation is there and I see the trends and I observe it and I feel familiarly, yes, this is how it would be. But I am still separate and an observer in the mental consciousness. So all of these belong to a range of phenomena which we see in occasional human beings as aberrations, prodigies. Somebody has a fall, is unconscious for a while, wakes up, and then this unusual faculty is working. So I read in my childhood many such incidents of people having a knock on the head and then waking up with this ability. And I said, wow, that must be useful. Maybe I get a few knocks and it'll help me wake up. Didn't help. But what was the role of the knock there? And we can say that it's as if the biology, the physical part of the mind, which is more like a screen of dullness, in the moment of the shock either releases or opens out to something of the inner, which functioning was always present, and then it comes through more smoothly. Recently I was in conversation with somebody about something called the God helmet. You might find it interesting to look it up. It's a device which was created to transmit energy, electromagnetic energy, to a particular location in the brain. So by having many points of stimulation from different direction, you can as if localize one part of the brain and intensely stimulate it from outside without touching the physical brain at all physically. So electromagnetic fields, magnetic fields, or some heating, temperature, or today many people try similar things with ultrasound. Basically you are causing a physical stimulation of a kind to a part of the brain, and depending on which part you stimulate, you find different faculties either dull or awaken. So in certain points of stimulation, as if memories of the past are vividly awakened. But in the God helmet, basic objective is to stimulate certain parts which puts the person in a mystical experience. Often it may take the form of sudden loss of physical body awareness, as if your consciousness is expanded and wide, or you find yourself floating, or you have an out-of-body experience, or you begin to perceive things which do not belong to the physical world. And in the example which somebody shared, a person who was a serial killer was put on the chair with the God helmet, and he saw images so horrifying he couldn't bear it, he got up and ran. And that gives you a glimpse. The consciousness which he is surrounded by, or the influences which are impacting on him, are of that order which made for his behavior. And the stimulation basically opened up to the perception of that world to which he had connected. Or equally, there are people who have experiences of angelic forms, visions, and so on. And all things associated with certain kinds of mystical experiences. And that's why it's called the God helmet. And of course, the scientific theory is we are stimulating the brain to give you a spiritual or mystical experience, and therefore your mystical experience is a product of the brain function. In reality, from the other perspective, we will say your deeper and higher ranges are normally closed to you because of the functioning of your brain, which is so dull, narrow, and limiting. And through this stimulation, you have as if dulled the limiting influence of the physical brain. You have opened the gates to those inner ranges whose influence come right through. The problem, of course, with any such physical stimulus is that very quickly the body begins to dull to those impacts. So you could ask, well, I don't need to meditate. I will sit with the God helmet and enter into higher states. Not quite. The effect is similar to what happens with physical drugs. You are momentarily open to the level of consciousness at which you live into its universality. You do not enter higher states. You enter into an opening of universality at the level where you are. So if you enter into the drugs with a state of fear and doubt, well, you will experience that domain of that grade of fear, doubt, and it will get enormously universalized and amplified, exaggerated. The same person enters the drugged state with some idealistic thought, and he will have experiences of beautiful idealistic scenes, but of that level at which you are. And something similar happens with the God helmet. All it's doing is removing the physical boundaries. Not very different from what happens quite spontaneously when you have an out-of-body experience or in certain dream states, when also your consciousness may separate from the physical body and experience things of its level. And there's a sense of widening and freedom, which is why you naturally have experiences of floating and flying and so on. So all of this is simply to point out that the capacities of the vital and mental body are enormously greater, corresponding to their equivalent capacities in your physical mind and physical vital and the physical body. But those enormously greater capacities are blocked out. And if or when or as you become more conscious in those bodies and their action now begins to impact your surface consciousness and begins to integrate, well, those enormously greater capacities now begin to work out. Sri Aurobindo puts it another way. He says the normal process of evolution is the organization of those capacities on the surface part of your physical consciousness. So your physical vital, for example, has the capacity to draw energy from the universe without needing food. As this power of energization begins to organize itself in your more surface parts, you find you're able to draw energy, not needing the physical support of food as much. But yes, the physical body still needs the food. Similarly, other powers of the mind begin to act. And often what happens as you develop some skill, it's as if some part of the inner which already had the skill now begins to reflect and organize, or becomes like a template for the organization on the surface to form. I don't know if you've ever had this experience where you felt, you see somebody do a skill and you say, I can feel in me that I can do it. I've never done it, but I can feel it, and I know if I put myself to it, I'll do it easily. And that's because you're sensing that capacity which is there in the inner vital or inner mental. And then as you begin to develop the skill, it's as if the familiarity of that reflects or acts as a template for your actions, which seem to be almost instinctively aligned to quickly pick up the skill. So Sri Aurobindo points out evolution, which is taking place in the surface part, is nothing but organizing those powers more and more on the surface. Except that we already have those powers in the vital and mental bodies. So, these vital mental bodies possess powers, senses and capacities which are always secretly acting in us. So in fact, when you are given that 10-digit number for multiplication, that part on the inner mind already knows, and it's already putting a suggestion forward, secretly acting, except your surface mind is busy now thinking, I think I have to do this process and I have lost myself in the actual calculation process, which involves so many steps. I'm not listening. Or if I turn in and try to listen or feel, then my imagination fills in. Is it this? Is it that? Is it that? And the vividness of these imaginative suggestions is perhaps more intense than the suggestion coming in from the inner mind. Or in the physical, in the inner vital, let's say, you want to lift something, the more difficult it seems, the harder you try. And in the very act of you trying, you're putting your surface physical vital into engagement and reducing your capacity. Whereas if you allowed the inner vital to come in with you trying less and allowing it to happen, that's when it happens and you feel almost it is effortless. And there are very simple practices which are often taught in the martial arts to allow for this influence to come up, which makes possible some unusual capacities when, for example, a Tai Chi master is able to remain in a very relaxed state and his hands, arms moving fluidly and able to move with a rapidity which is far greater, precisely because the physical hand was completely relaxed, removing the barriers for the vital physical to act directly. And so what you recognize, in the same way as the God helmet removed the barrier of the physical brain to allow things of the inner ranges to come up, in your surface personality, the less you do, the less you are, and the more you open to the inner and higher, the more that comes through more easily, more directly. And all these capacities can similarly pour through. And a large part of any kind of specialized training involves letting go. Giving a form to the outer consciousness to awaken it, make it conscious, and then allowing it as a receptacle to receive the influences from the inner or higher to do the real thing. Well, the same is true also of your physical body. And especially when it concerns health, illness, resolution of illnesses. If you could simply become aware of the knot and consciously open out and let it go, the things of the inner or higher could simply flow through, clear them out. But we are not aware, we are unable to become aware, and so we remain locked in and bound in our narrow surface personality. So this much as regards capacities, because there is a continuum between the inner and the outer. We now look at the senses, and we recognize that each grade of consciousness has its own senses. Sri Aurobindo explains later on in the supramental sense, the chapter titled Supramental Sense, he says that ultimately all sense, and I'm reading the line now from the chapter titled The Supramental Sense. Sense is fundamentally not the action of certain physical organs, but the contact of consciousness with its objects. When the consciousness of the being is withdrawn wholly into itself, it is aware only of itself, of its own being, its own consciousness, its own delight, its own concentrated essence. When it comes out of immersion, it becomes aware of it, releases or develops out of its immersion its activities and forms of consciousness, delight and force. And if you look at the whole universe as being only this consciousness withdrawn, consciousness revealing, all experiences consciousness meeting object, but itself in object, consciousness meeting consciousness. That means wherever there is consciousness, there is perception, there is sense. And because consciousness operates, or rather represents itself in form and limitation through 5 gradations of self-limitation, you have 5 senses. Everywhere, in all states of being, in all levels of consciousness, in all layers, in all parts. Very simply. Now, if everything has 5 senses, in a sense, it's obviously, we don't register it as different senses. We rather feel my consciousness here had perception and then it moved there and had perception. So we think it's my consciousness having senses. Actually, my consciousness was a center that moved, but there are senses operative wherever there is consciousness. So you are normally conscious of the world, perceiving through your biological organs, because your consciousness is identified with your physical body and physical vitality and physical mind. So it looks at or perceives the world through its physicality and depends therefore on the organs. But notice how you can close your eyes and still continue to see. The sense of sight remains even with physical eyes closed, but the physical sight is blocked out, but your mind's eye can still continue to see the picture of things around you. So you look at the trees, close your eyes, keep holding the image of the trees. So the sense of sight is still operative, isn't it? Who is seeing? It's the mind's awareness. When you open your physical sight, it is the same mind's awareness that is plugged into your physical senses and looking through it. And we discover therefore that we have actual sight in the consciousness of mind as it plugs into the biological senses. You can damage the biological senses, but this mind's sight can never be damaged. And if somehow it could be disentangled from its obsessive fixation on the physical biology and its organs, if it could disentangle, it would be able to look directly also. And this is how the subtle sight begins to operate. And there are exercises which are often taught in many of these basic practices where they will ask you to. Mother describes this exercise. She says, as a child, she would be in her room and then she would as if project herself out, walking out, visualizing with deep and rich detail, going through the door, going down the steps, and then trying to see what's happening downstairs. If you notice in the very exercise, what is being projected? It's your mind's sight, mind's awareness rather. And as your mind's awareness is projected, its perception is of course registering things. At first, you're creating images with your imagination. But as the projection begins to become more and more complete and extends actually out into that space, the perception of that space begins to reflect on your imaginative creation. And at some point can even replace the imaginative creation, and you have the sense of actual seeing. Very simple exercise that Mother describes, but you can see how this could be developed and perfected to almost any degree. Mother even describes somewhere else, she uses this phrase, you can extend the nervous, the vocabulary she uses is the nervous sensation of your senses, and as if listening, you listen as if listening very far and extend out to the sound of the birds outside, and bit by bit you have as if a sense as if your hearing is extending farther and farther. And it's as if something of the nervous consciousness actually projects out and therefore perceives and listens for a much greater distance. All of this is still actually happening at a level in the physical body, and that's why the nervous energy is involved. But the perception, remember, is happening by the mind. through the physical body and through this projected sense of our consciousness. But if it simply withdrew from the physical body, it would still see directly. And seeing directly, it could easily expand itself, extend itself. For example, one of the things that happens when you shift to the mind's awareness, and you can try this as an experiment, your physical sight is looking at this picture, close your eyes, see with your mind's awareness, and then notice your mind's awareness is not bound to this narrow picture range of the human sight, maybe some 80 degrees, and then it fades out peripherally. But to the mind's awareness, maybe you have this picture, but you're actually aware all around. Notice that. Interesting. So already the mind's awareness, freed from the physical senses, has a 360-degree awareness. And then if you stay aware all around, you notice there's a kind of a perception, a visualization of this whole space, a sense of this whole space. And if you dwell on it, you can even tune in your listening to listen to what is behind you. You can as if reach out and palpably, as if touching the space around you with your mind's awareness, with the quality of your mind. Interesting, isn't it? And already you recognize your physical senses are what are narrowing and limiting, what to the mind, which is the actual sense, is much freer and wider. So when you actually step out of your physical body or enter into the mental body, subtle body, and either in dream state or in an out-of-body experience or simply shifting awareness into it, immediately your awareness is all around. But by habit of your normal waking existence, you may tend to keep a focus of narrowness in front. When you're in the mental body or the vital body, holding a narrow focus immediately brings you to narrow identification. Whereas the natural state of those bodies is to be in a environmental or situational awareness, where you're aware all around equally. And you're actually seeing all around equally. So when you first step out into your subtle body, the habit of the physical body is what limits. And that tends to wake you up, because in the or makes you lose awareness. But if you train yourself to remain in this 360-degree awareness in a waking state, you can step out in the subtle body and hold that awareness, and then you can stay conscious without losing the link. So these are basic practices which can be taught, and a person can be very quickly through stages be brought to not only experiencing these things but developing them. In fact, in the next sentence he will say, by development, by self-development, we can become aware of them. But we'll see that later. And I'm describing these things as the methods of self-development, which logically come from basic observation of the difference between these senses or states of consciousness, or the quality of consciousness in the subtle body, vital body, or physical body. So, these bodies possess powers, senses, and capacities. We have looked at capacities which are greater, senses which are also greater, but not gone deep enough. The senses of the vital inherently are perceptions of the nature of the vital energy. And so when the vital looks at something or senses something, it registers life force. Somebody comes and you have the sense that you are all droopy and grey today. What you're perceiving is the life force. You're translating it into a vocabulary which is familiar to the physical sight. And you may say you're applying physical vocabulary to energy. Yes, partly true. Actually, the vital sight is much greater and more rich. The physical sight is more limiting. And so although you use the vocabulary from here to there, you find the vocabulary inadequate. In fact, the vital sight merges the five senses to some degree. Unlike physical sight, where we have physical organs which separate the five senses, but actually in the meeting which takes place in the consciousness inhabiting, all five are joined in a single perception. And so in the yoga tradition we say the sixth sense is the mind, which is the real seeing agent. And if on that level the five senses come together, they even tend to blend into each other. And you will see this is not so uncommon. You look at a cloud and you can as if feel the softness of the cloud like cotton, as if you were touching it. You notice that? You can actually feel its softness in the very sight. And then you stay for a while and describe what it smells like. Can you describe what it sounds like? The sound of cloud, and you have a glimpse of something, maybe more difficult to perceive. But it has something soft, it has something which is absorbent. The sound is not metallic, rather it's soft dulling, almost like cottony sound, absorbent sound. You look at a metal piece at a distance, you can feel, touch its shine and hear the tinny metallic sound of its resonance. Actually, all five senses are blending in your mind. In the vital perception, which is much more direct, this blending is much more vivid also. And so the result is, I feel, let's take the example of somebody who's a bit depressed or dull, grey aura. I feel this greyness, it has a heaviness. It has a smoky character. You see, I'm describing sensation, weight, and it feels resistant, as if it does not allow light to penetrate. If I push, it's sticky. If I put my hand in it and pull out, something stays sticking. Now these are all descriptions you use to describe what? Contact your energy with another's energy. Or let's take the opposite. Today you're so bright, so clear, so transparent. I feel almost nourished in the clarity of your vitality or your energy, because there's immediately a contact and a transmission. A person walks into the room and there is a radiance. And if the radiance is strong enough, it doesn't matter negative or positive. If it's strong enough, it touches everybody immediately and affects the mood of the room. And when 100 of us are in the same room, well, all our energies mingle to create some kind of a large mix in which the higher ones get pulled down by the lower ones get pulled down by the higher, and there's a kind of an overall blending. And that's why you come away from a group, let's say, or while you're in the group, you find your thoughts, emotions and behavior pulled into the group behavior. And that's what they call mob psychology. You do things you would not have done normally because your consciousness is now held in this collective vital. You step out of it, and it takes a while for that infusion to gradually seep out. Because it's sticky, it stays in you, and it takes a while for the system to eject it. Depending again on how clear your own basis is or how deep the infection or mixture has taken place, it could even take a day or two. I found this often when I would go to certain types of public programs where it was different when I had to speak because energetically my position was different with the group. But it was different when I was part of an audience, and there I would find myself very quickly overwhelmed with the group energy. I would come out and it would feel so strange. I don't feel myself anymore. I'm still carrying that energy. And often it would take at least one night's sleep or sometimes a whole day before the remnant of it would fade out. But during the time when it was there, it was easy to notice how certain patterns of thought would come up, which were not normal. And I would say, where is this coming from? But if you're not conscious, you can easily find yourself misled, and erroneously think that those thoughts or those emotions are yours, when in fact they are not. That's why a space like this, or a spiritual, intentional community, choosing to hold certain standards, everybody joining, choosing to live by some higher reference, makes for a field and a collective energy field of the community that can actually help lift and hold on a higher level the whole consciousness. So this is as far as vital senses. We've still not completed. So the vital sense, you see, has this fivefold aspect much more deeply integrated than the physical sense, where they are there separate but yet integrated. The vital, it's much more felt in a single touch. And so it's more difficult to describe. And often what we find is it's more easy to describe the contact and feel than the image or seeing. So let's say you feel somebody's energy, you describe the energy. It feels light, it feels clear, and then from there the image forms and the colors come. It feels as if whitish clear, bright or intense. Or it's lifting rather than pulling down. The quality of energy. The picture emerges. And this was what was found when the US government had this program to develop in the US military the possibility of training people for remote viewing. They found that at first the impulse or the point of contact would be the tangibility of the energy. And so the training went like this. You start by describing weight, heaviness, lightness, sensation. Don't go to size yet. Having described the quality of it, they would say, now from here naturally you emerge to sense of size. It's heavy, but it's narrow. It's heavy, but it's large. Or it's dense, very large. And then what is the quality of that denseness? It's fluid, it's not rigid. And you have no idea what you're talking about except for that quality. And bit by bit you would move from that to smells, from touches, sizes, smells, tastes, and images would eventually emerge. And you were asked not to try to picture, not to visualize. You stayed with this, and if you went through, a picture would come and then you would be able to describe a quality by familiarity. It feels as if I am at the bottom of an ocean and in front of me there is this big object that feels metallic. And it so happens that you were asked to project to a sunken shipwreck in the ocean. But to get to that point, you had this fluid, dense, dark place, and then something metallic but separate, small compared to this, and you're describing everything from sensations eventually leading to image. So again, there are ways of training by which one can develop the capacity. The mental body has senses which are much more free even than the vital, much more clear, and the quality of thought is much more refined, much more wide, and so it's easy to perceive things there. And if similarly you were to perceive purely at the thought level, you would sense the quality of thought in another first. Just as in the vital, you perceive the vital energy of another first, not the physical body. But through the vital, you can perceive the physical. Similarly, through the mental, you sense the mental state of another. And from there, perhaps the vital, and perhaps get a glimpse of the physical. And so again, these are all interesting insights, but what we discover is these bodies have their own senses. Much more clear, much more free. The distinctive character of the mental sense, though, which is not there in the vital or the physical, is its fluidity, its freedom allows you also to perceive backward and forward in time. Whereas the vital is still bound in time, although free of space. So you can, for example, feel somebody you're speaking to on a video call. The person may be physically on the other side of the world. You feel them close. You feel their presence vividly in the room during the call even. The call stops and the presence fades. But at the moment, because you were energetically connected, you felt the energy distinctly. But in the same moment across space. But when you connect on a mental level, one can even perceive things of the past or trends of the future, which you can't do on the energetic level. And so it is the higher gradation of perception which allows you to also perceive the future or even experience things from the past as if they're happening right now. But it doesn't mean the future is fixed. This is a problem people have. Why is it I can see the past accurately, but I can't see the future accurately and it can change? What's the difference? And Sri Aurobindo is the only one to give you this clue, and I have not found it anywhere else. He says, when you actually look at the past, you are not simply glimpsing what happened, but also what tried to happen. And distinguishing between the two may not be so easy. And in the same way, when you're glimpsing the future, you're glimpsing what is trying to happen, but not just one thing, but many things which are trying to happen. Equally as in the past. Even in the present, if you may glimpse many things which could have been happening. But to distinguish between which of the future will happen, which won't, that's something different, and it requires a different, deeper discrimination. And there's a whole discussion of that in the supramental sense. But in fact, past, present or future, there are many things one could have glimpsed, and one should be able to pinpoint accurately what the actual thing is. And therefore, in the mental consciousness, the mental perception, the variations, vividness are much more rich, much more plastic, but also less formed. Already you can see from the physical form, the flower can be described, it has so many petals. It has such distinct colors, and the whole picture can be reduced literally to a physical image of form. In the vital consciousness, you look at the flower, you feel the bundle of quality of energy. It's already blurred, form is blurred. And you may sense if the petals have distinctive qualities. If you take, for example, psychological perfection, which has always 5 petals. Now this rose will not always have the same number of petals. So there's nothing distinctive of the petals. But psychological perfection will always have 5. And so each of the 5 is distinctive. And if you see that flower in the vital body, you will sense its 5-fold character. Psychological perfection is 5-fold, and Mother lists those 5 qualities. But rose does not have a fixed number. Number is not relevant. You don't perceive it in the vital body. You will rather perceive the sweetness of the rose or the quality of love, and that's why it takes the form, expression of divine love is what the rose represents. And so all forms in the vital are in terms of these distinctive qualities of energy. If you look at a divine being who appears before you, the powers of action of the divine being will represent themselves as arms. Now you understand why deities are described with multiple arms. It's not a caricature, it's not a distortion, they are not genetic mutations. They are not physical bodies. They are perceived in the vital, where each distinct function or power is like a projection of energy with its quality, and so you see them in that way. In the mental world, that may not have the same value. And so depending on where you perceive, you will see the divine beings also in different ways. Where form becomes less important in the mental world, the quality of the idea will be the dominant thing. And if in the idea there are multiple aspects, you would see it in multiple facets, forms, petals, arms, but idea level, not energetic level. And so the image of 1,000 names of Vishnu, Vishnu Sahasranama, or 1,000 names of Divine Mother, and the 1,000-fold is not so much the number, but the sense of completeness of all facets. And that's much more in the realm of mind. And similarly in the Buddhist tradition, you'll have Buddha with 1,000 arms. The number is no more relevant, it's the fullness of multiplicity. Come down to the vital, it'll be 4, 8 or whatever distinctive number, where the number has relevance. And it's not a symbolic number anymore, but represents the aspects of powers. So this is, I think, covers reasonably in depth the idea of subtle senses and how different they are. But what is important is they are all impacting on us right now. That means their influence is actually there. Even as I look at flower, something within me is catching the influence of the vital sight and the mental sight, which is taking place in the vital and mental bodies. But I'm too busy with my physical senses to register them. Except that if that registration is strong enough, something leaks through. And I look at the flower and I say, oh, this flower, it's fading, it's unhappy. Why? it feels it is neglected, or it feels it doesn't have enough water, or whatever it is. Some sense of a perception, and then you say, oh, but it must be my imagination. I went to a particular place and I had the sense as if there was a presence there. Very often it happens in nature. You go to a pond, water bodies typically, and you sense as if something is watching you or something is present there, or as if you're infringing in someone's privacy. You say, oh, it's my imagination. No, you're actually perceiving it. Only you are not giving to it the importance, or the clarity of perception has not become vivid enough because you don't live on those levels where the perception is quite clear by itself. And if you paid attention, you could even sense what kind of presence it is and what its question is, what its discomfort with your presence is. And perhaps you could align, you could take permission. But once you get into that domain, it can become quite complicated, especially if you are actually half here and half there and are translating those experiences in these terms. So I give an example. Often shamans are really people living in the vital world and physical world, or halfway in between. And it stops there. It doesn't really go into a spiritual domain. And so shamans have all these connections with nature beings, nature spirits, and so on. I remember once we were in Japan, and there was a shaman, medicine man from Africa, chief of his area, and we were having some conversation, and on his own he said, well, normally we would have taken permission of the mountain before we come to visit it. So I said, well, okay, let's do that. So he said, no, I cannot, because I am chief of my region in Africa, and here whoever is chief, he is the one who has to take permission. So to me it was a bit too much. So I said, okay. I asked why. He said, well, this is not my domain. I said, wonderful. Then can't you ask the mountain, can I take permission to have relationship with you? And then he laughed. He said, yes, you got it. The point was, he was stuck in a certain frame, and you all only had to step out of it, and it's not so narrow. But you reduced it to human laws, human regulations, human dominions and territories. But wherever you go, there is spontaneously a relationship. And the relationship may involve even something deeper within you, entering in relation with the mountain where you are not conscious here. The mountain welcomes you, you are not conscious here, but you just feel good being there. Or the mountain says, no, I don't like your presence here, and you feel somehow uncomfortable and you go away very quickly. But if you were more conscious, simply, or even not sensing things inside, go through the process of asking, respectfully saying, may I please have your permission to sit here for a while and enjoy the beauty of your scenery. And then you feel the tension go away. And already that's part of the sensitivity we all have. So, the vital and mental bodies have capacities as well as senses which are impinging on us all the time, and they're connected, and we'll look at that later. The third thing, though, which Sri Aurobindo puts first, is powers. These have powers which are much greater, which don't belong to the physical. And there we touch upon some examples. The vital body has powers which transcend form and limitation of physical space, and that's something which is in no way at a physical level has an equivalent. So the vital body can actually feel something, someone, and be instantly in contact. The mental body similarly, as we saw, going in the past and future, but they are distinctive powers, and the senses follow those powers, as well as the capacities tend to lean on those powers. That's why in the sequence Sri Aurobindo puts the powers first, senses later, and capacities later, because they all draw from these powers and are modified by these powers. We went the other way, so you can see how the powers actually exist in this, but the powers exist independently. So in the vital consciousness, everything is somehow flowing through everything. You step out, and we read from the mother earlier, you are in the vital body, All the energies all around are passing right through. And yet the vital body has the capacity to distinguish one from another, choose to align with one and not align with another. And because all the energies are flowing through, the location of the energy is almost irrelevant. So you can tune into an energy which now is properly on Mars or belongs to the planet Mars. And its impact on you is there right now because you tuned into it, or you tune into the energy of Jupiter and you have the impact of Jupiter now, right now here. As if it is here, because in fact it is here. All energies are passing right through everywhere at the same time. And so there's a very unusual experience there. The things which are important for you suddenly feel close and invasive to you in the vital body. The things which are not important or which you don't believe in are as if far or unreal to you because they're too far, or not non-existent because you don't feel them anymore. But they're all there at the same time. Now you see what this means. This has tremendous implications. If you believe in astrology, if you believe that the planets are pushing, pulling and playing with your destiny and you're a puppet of your chart and horoscope, well, you step out in your vital body and you feel all these energies. And those who reject it and say, I don't believe, this is all nonsense, I am master of my own destiny and I'm not going to concern myself, you come out in your vital body, those influences are there, but you feel them far. Because that's the relationship you have set up. That's the tuning of alignment you have made. Now you see how important this is. And so Mother puts it in a different way. She says, if you believe in the planets, if you pay attention to them, then they pay attention to you and their influence on you is stronger, their hold on you is stronger. And that's why if you don't believe in them, actually their influence is less on you. They're all there. Of course, all influences are there at the same time. And astrology does not concern itself with the physical influence of the planets. It's not the gravitational field of Jupiter, which is too weak, or the moon's gravitation, which actually can create tides in a glass of water. But it's so small. And then people will say, that's the reason why it controls hormones in you. No, it's not. Nothing to do with tides or gravity. It is the energetic quality, and the hormones in your consciousness are a physical representation of a certain energy, and these are similar energy. Therefore, they collide or they influence. And the tides of the moon affect the hormonal tides within you because of the energetic connection. But again, if you connect to it, you feel it. So there are people who will say, well, it's full moon, let's go out and connect to the moon and bathe in its influence. And yes, you're opening yourself and engaging with it. It can be helpful. But you're also engaging with its tides and participating in those flows. Or you can simply cut yourself off from it. You will not get the helpful energy either, but you will not be bound to those tidal movements either. Or you can choose to engage when you want and disengage when you don't want. And this you will find is the basis for most of the magical ceremonies. So they want basically to connect on a vital level with the vital influences and activate or amplify those influences. You take an object which resonates with the moon, take an object which has energetic resonance to Mars, take an object resonating to Jupiter, because I took these examples now, rearrange them in a certain way, and you have as if rearranged those energies in your local space in a certain way, physically, because you're holding the forms. But vitally is where your links are. And you could discard the physical object and vitally pull the energy and invoke and amplify and gain the same result. Or you could bypass all these and enter in relation with the one source of all energy, of which these are all specializations, and invoke the Divine Mother, which invokes all her thousandfold infinite facets and aspects, asking her to set right with her wisdom, with her pattern of energy influence, what needs to be done. And maybe you're far more effective, or she is far more effective than your magical processes. But you understand why the magical processes work. You understand why they had a place in human affairs, because it was easy access to narrow, specific, limited outcomes. But from a spiritual point of view, it's useful but unnecessary, because there's something much greater, much more complete, more true, more powerful, and with far greater wisdom than yours, which can impact and change. So I have not gone too much in depth with powers, but this is one example of how they function fundamentally differently. The same thing with the mind body, it has powers, which are particularly the power of freedom from space and time, but also the power to identify even with things which it has never known before. You see, in the vital plane, you at least have some kind of affinity which makes it easy to connect. In the mind, an idea. So, example, Mother speaks of how somebody in a lecture in Paris, she knew nothing about Eastern traditions at that point. Someone in a lecture spoke of the Indian philosophy and Bhagavad Gita, and then he spoke the word Om. And in the very moment where the Om was spoken, she felt the whole room flooding with the light. And at that point, you see, in the mind awareness and in the mind's perception, you have touched a symbol, but the symbol relates to something which immediately draws the result of that. And this is the power of the idea. You have never experienced what might be called the Brahman. But when the word is spoken or the concept is revealed, something of your mind actually touches it through the concept. And you will find this is the approach in the yoga of knowledge, or the paths of entry through the awareness of mind. Dwelling on a concept begins to take you into the experience. And the concept is a mind or thought vehicle. But the vehicle can very easily perceive, because it's already more fluid than the vital or physical. And if this were not possible, we could never have known of things which we have not directly experienced. And evolution would be impossible to us consciously. But because this is there, even somebody speaking the word who has not the experience of it, the word, the idea carries the touch of it, and it's enough to make the link. And this is how many interesting phenomena are possible, which otherwise you cannot explain. Somebody approaches the mother and says, such and such a person is ill and asks for your blessings. Maybe there's a telegram, maybe there's a message which came. Let's say in today's world we will say a phone call. The person mentions a name. Or maybe not the name, you say, my brother's daughter. I have not mentioned a name. And the mother receives that, and the blessings go, and immediately there is an effect. What was the point of link? You say, my brother's daughter. Where is my brother's daughter? On the other side of the world, in some hospital, in the house. I have not even spoken of the illness. Who is this person? How does she know? There is no GPS point to say, I have to concentrate on this location, in this hospital, on this ward, bed number such and such. How does she connect? You see, when you think in physical terms, you have to have a physical location. But when you see in mind terms, in the mental body, the moment you have said, my brother's daughter, the idea of it which came from your consciousness entering in me has already the link. And in the very word touching, the link is there, and through that link now the consciousness is put, or the help is given, and even if there's a vital energy of help to be given, it can flow. It's very interesting, the way thought can carry anything, any content, or the touch of anything. And this is a power, this is so unique. And it can be transmitted across. Please tell the mother, my brother's daughter. So someone now comes and says, so-and-so in the ashram's brother's daughter. Doesn't matter. So when in the military experiments which the CIA was developing for remote viewing, They would have experiments to see something. They found if we tell us the weather of such and such a city, immediately your mind kicks in and starts thinking, well, if I say, what's the weather in Moscow? I'm thinking, well, Moscow is towards the north, it should be cooler than it is here, and already all those things are coming in. So what they would do is, to remove your mind confusions or expectations, they would tell you coordinates. So, such and such longitude, such and such latitude, just series of numbers. And the person has no idea where it is, and it was more accurate because there was less of the expectation mixing in. And then they discovered that even when they gave a wrong number, the idea you had was enough to make the link. So I'm thinking of Moscow, but I actually wrote the wrong number of coordinates. But the person still gets Moscow. And then they replaced even coordinates by numbers, random numbers. And then what they did was, they would write a question. So let's say I'm looking for I want you to see the Titanic which is sunk in the bottom of the Atlantic. Describe its condition. I write this as a question, put it in an envelope, and write on the envelope a number at random. So as a routine, I think they used to have 6 digits or 8 digits. No, it was 8 digits, 4 and 4. So 41852163. Now the person who is made to do the remote view is just told 41852163 and click. There's the link taking place. Why? Because I created an association in mind between number and this question, which is actually a thought link to that physical object. You see how it works? And it's more precise, more accurate, because none of the material surface mind expectations come in. What if somebody else uses the same number for their own test, not realizing we have repeated the same number? It doesn't matter. Because the link of thought idea is what is being transmitted. You see how important this is? The moment you remember someone, in the mind consciousness, mind body, a link is created. And it does not matter if the person is in the physical body or has gone into the subtle body, because it is a link in the mind consciousness. And the mind, being much more elastic, much more supple, can even touch things which are bordering the consciousness of mind. For example, the perception of the self, which is beyond mind, and yet something of the self can lean into mind as if, and you can catch that as a mental idea and convey that. And Sri Aurobindo speaks of how, I think when he was 12, he was reading some commentary on the Isha Upanishad, and he had spontaneously the experience of the self in the mind. That's how it describes it. And this is possible for all of us. Simply by dwelling on the idea of self, we begin to enter in relation with the self, but through the mind consciousness. So I am digressing. I come back to the example of the remote viewing. So it happened once that they were to do a demonstration. Someone senior from the military came. He had written his question in an envelope, written a number, but he left behind the envelope in his office. And so he comes here, he's traveled a long way, he says, sorry, I forgot my envelope, how do we do the test? Too late. And they say, no problem, we'll do the test. And they pose the question, we want to see that thing which is mentioned in the envelope, which is in such and such person's desk in his office in this city. Good enough. The idea link was enough to go through any number of links. And then one example I'll end with, the person, one of these remote viewers was in Japan doing a demonstration on television. And the plan was that somebody from the studio would actually they would have 7 envelopes with different images in each of these. Somebody would go away at a distance, open one of these envelopes at random. Whatever image was there, he would go to that location and be there by a certain time, and this person was to remote view where he was and describe it. You see, they're all thinking in physical terms. So it so happens, they open an envelope, they take an envelope, he goes there. Nobody knows in the studio where he is, but at that time we are asked, we turn to the remote viewer, where is he now? Remote viewer pulls out a paper from his pocket and says, last night after dinner I sat down and I asked this question: what is the location that the person will be in at this time after having opened his envelope? And here is the picture, and he pulls out the picture, and it's exactly the place he was at, on some bridge. You see how it went? The question was, what will happen tomorrow as an outcome of such a series of events? You remote view it now, and that's it, it's done. And it doesn't matter what level of complexity you may add in the physical chain, it doesn't matter to the mind. Where is the person going to be at 6 p.m. tomorrow is good enough as a question, you get straight there. How you get through physical chain has no meaning. So the reality of the mental world is so different. So much more simple, so much more direct, but also so much more rich in complexity. So, all of these are powers of being of the mental body and the vital body and their senses operating and their capacities, which, Sri Aurobindo says, are always secretly acting in us, are connected with and impinge upon our physical organs and the plexuses of our physical life and mentality. Now we come to this idea of how are they connecting, where are they connecting, and what's the nature of that link. So first, always acting, but secretly acting. We are not conscious, but always, 24 hours, day and night. You may be sleeping, but all those things are acting on you. A person, let's say the Prime Minister of a country, or President of the country, head of state. Imagine how many people are thinking of him at this very moment, especially when there's a controversy. And every morning when the newspapers put out headlines abusing or criticizing the head of state, people read that and they feel this strong discomfort with thought connecting to a person. It's literally as if all these thought, emotional energies touch the person on those levels and impact on the subtle body. What does the person feel? If he is conscious, he can feel the pressure of all these things. And what does it do to the surface personality and their behavior? It's not easy. Inevitably, you find yourself compelled to conform to the pressure which is built up. Which is the reason why you see often politicians make promises, they get to power and they find difficult to do what they have to do. Because suddenly they're trapped in this huge complex of energy. And if they do not have either sufficiently a higher spiritual influence which can rise above these energies, or a very strongly individualized vital, they cannot disengage from this influence and act freely. And this is just to give you one example, because it's an exaggerated example of someone who is head of state. You see how important this is. But this is happening to us every day, in a much milder level. But equally, we are doing this to others unknowingly. When we think about something with someone with negative thoughts, you're actually sending out an influence which is affecting them. And if they're somewhat conscious, they may sense tension with you or not. But it'll still be there and it'll affect, it will influence. And if someone puts out goodwill and positive thoughts, it can clarify and clear the atmosphere so much and spread so much good, positive vibration. In the Buddhist tradition, this thing is given great importance. They have this loving kindness meditation, metta meditation, where you try to spread goodwill towards all and positive vibrations towards all beings, all sentient beings, and so on. There's of course another aspect to it where they want to take in the suffering of others. I'm not sure how helpful that is, but the aspect of giving goodwill is always good. Taking another's suffering, not very healthy for you. And it's not even necessary. It doesn't necessarily free them from the suffering, but well, that's how it is. But the point here is secretly acting in us, and the powers, senses and capacities are secretly acting in us, but are connected with and impinge upon our physical organs and the plexuses. So they are connected and they impinge upon. So the two words we are going to dwell upon the two things, because this link is extremely important. Through this link we will also be able to access things of those bodies. So impinge has the sense impact. It comes from the same root as impact. It has a sense of violent collision. In its more modern usage, it takes the form of influence or push, but in the original sense, impinge has this violent collision. So something comes in the mental body or the vital body, well, it has on the surface, wham, a punch. You may not be conscious, but it's there still. The impinging means it has a forceful effect. The first word he has used though is are connected. All of these are connected with and impinge upon what? Our physical organs and plexuses. So there are two things which are there in us where these two things link. In the physical organ there is a link, and in the plexus, which is not a physical organ, there is also a link. Between the two, the difference is only of gradation. In the physical organ, the link is much more material. So let's take an example here. In your abdominal region and the working of the organs, the influence of the vital is much stronger. In the chest region, the higher vital, we would say, closer to the mind. In the head region, you'll have the impact of the thoughts much more. In fact, it's very easy to see how illnesses on these levels correspond to the level of knot in your psychology. So illnesses of the abdomen generally have vital roots, illnesses of the head have mental roots, and so on, because there's a physical connection. In the organs, particularly as far as it concerns senses, we see this more obviously. Your mental perception of sight connects to your physical organs, obviously. Similarly, mental hearing connects to physical hearing. So all our physical organs have their corresponding link to the actual mental or vital senses linking through, which means when you're physically seeing, you're also active on those other levels, unconsciously. That's why when I look at the person, I'm conscious, oh, you're feeling sad, because I made a link on the vital. But equally, the person enters the room, and before you have had any physical sense contact, on the vital level there's a point of touch, and you sense a shift. And maybe even you sense who it is. I remember once, it was at a time when I was extremely sensitive to these things. I was sitting in the ashram archives where I was working, and just behind the wall was the staircase. So anybody coming up was often within 1 meter of us energetically. Okay, just one wall separating, but you couldn't hear, you couldn't see. And suddenly I had this strange shift of a lady who was my classmate, whom I had not met for years. And I said, oh, it is a vibe which is so similar to that. And then 10 seconds later, this girl comes, and it's her. And it was literally a physical impact of the energy, awakening a memory of familiarity, which had then to say, oh, it's vibration similar to X. It's just that we are not normally conscious. And imagine what it's like when you're in a hotel room, you're lying on a bed, your head is normally against the wall. That's how the beds are arranged. You never sleep the other way. On the other side of the wall is another bed with the head of that person close to the wall. And your heads are within less than 1 meter of each other normally. Imagine what that does energetically. You are in the ambience of somebody. And of course it has an influence. And of course you're surrounded by, if you could, as if in your mind's eye, visualize the whole hotel building, let's say 100 rooms, all the walls become transparent. You are piled up one over the other and like a grid with mirror image heads against each other, creating a very interesting field. Fortunately, everybody is asleep, so things are relatively quiet. But if you're in a workspace and there's a large activity going on, a lot of energy thriving, across the walls there's a lot of seepage. And very quickly an office room or an office team builds up a kind of a collective energy, positive or negative or whatever form it is. You enter the office and you feel boosted by the energy drive. If your boss has high energy, everybody gets lifted. Boss has weak energy, everybody feels a little low. All of these things are part of that complex play. But the physical sense entering kicks in the perception of the other senses. And that's why initially we are blinded by the physical sight, although the other senses are there. And you will notice when people have to feel, they will tend to close physical eyes and try to feel like that, to precisely remove this blinding perception. Or the physical eyes glaze out and you perceive by the inner sight. So there is a connection of physical organs. The powers have a connection to certain centers, also physical organs. In the vital body, for example, corresponding to the heart, is a particular operation of life force. And we have discussed this, I think, last time, the life energy, the Vyana, movement of spreading out. Which is the organ in your body, biologically, which is the most obviously organ for spreading out anything? Not the lungs, not the kidneys, not the liver, heart, which is pushing blood to every part of the body. So literally one can say the physical heart becomes the link point for the Vyana operation of prana. Although Vyana operation is everywhere, in connection to a physical organ it is here. Similarly, the prana vayu, which is the drawing in of life force, which is the part in your body which is most directly absorbing life energy. Of course, lungs, breathing. And so the physical lungs are directly connected to the operation of the prana. And in this way you can find every organ of your body maps to certain powers, senses, and even certain capacities. And so Sri Aurobindo has just put it in a very simple phrase. These bodies possess powers, senses, capacities, which are always secretly acting in us, are connected with and impinge upon our physical organs and the plexuses of our physical life and mentality. Very simply stated, but how much rich content is actually held in this simple statement. Every organ which has any significant role corresponds to a particular power in the vital and mental body. In fact, this insight Sri Aurobindo brings to effect when he discusses the transformation of the physical body. He says increasingly as the physical body acquires this higher gradation of operation, of a diviner consciousness, the physical limitations will be overcome. And the organs themselves will begin to operate more and more directly, less by material process, more by their equivalent direct action of consciousness and power of consciousness. So what is heart doing? It's pushing out energy and nutrition to the rest of the body. Increasingly, as the operation of the heart pumping is replaced by the direct action of this energy being pushed out, the physical heart will be replaced in its functioning by an energetic push of this free consciousness. Mother speaks of this in this context when she's speaking of transformation of her body. She says this is a difficult question. At what point do you make the transition? It's literally as if the heart has to stop and the other operation has to take over, isn't it? So somewhere there'll be a point of transition where this organ now changes its mode of working and a new operation takes place in the physical body itself. And then she said, and this is something she said over a period of 10 years to her attendants. She said, if ever you find that my heart has stopped functioning, don't think my body is dead. I may be in this passage of transition from this functioning to that functioning. And so you wait. Of course, when she finally left her body, there was a whole 6-month preparation of withdrawal, and so everybody knew that she had been withdrawing, and that question didn't come up. But before that, in the 10 years before, from the 1960s onwards, she had told this to every single one of her attendants, and everybody knew this. Sri Aurobindo similarly speaks of other changes. Let's say, what is the role of the bones in your body? They serve no function at all except to give rigidity. If you want to lift an object, I cannot lift this unless there is some part which is rigid, isn't it? But if the very tissue of my body now acquires the ability to become rigid at will or flexible at will, which would be nature of material which is transformed, well, you won't need to have the rigidity of the bones. All the material would be able to be rigid as needed. Or the teeth. What role do they play? They're just the hard edge for your gums to be able to crush food. And so Mother makes this observation in the supramental body, you won't have teeth. Why? Because the very tissue of the gums would be able to harden as needed. You won't need to eat the same way, perhaps. You would also draw in nutrition in a different way. Mother spoke of how she could breathe from the flowers and draw the nutrition just from that. There are other ways in which you could absorb. You do not need this biological esophageal function. You may still keep it, or the supramental body may or may not keep it for a certain appreciation of experience or not. We don't know. But Sri Aurobindo points out every organ will begin to replace its physiological functioning in physical structure and dependent on physical structure by the direct operation of the power which it corresponds to. So there are certain organs, such as, for example, livers, whose function is purification of the blood. So the purifying action in the vital body, which separates out the nourishing energy and the coarser energy to be expelled, is represented here in the liver. When the liver organ is more and more transformed, there will be direct operation of the purification of energy and substance by direct function of consciousness willing it, and the organic dependence on molecular structures would become less and less. So in the transition towards transformation of the physical body, you will find the same organs will now work with far greater efficacy, with much less biological dependence, achieving the same result. And that would be a first sign that the body is now beginning to live by a higher grade of working or consciousness. And so this point he makes about the connection with the physical organs is extremely valuable. Not only he is describing how it's connected, but in that connection is also the future of the physical body in its transformation. But in that connection also is the link from the physical body to the vital body to the mental body. And that's why you will see in many yogic practices, they concentrate on specific locations or organs. Of course, we are coming to the plexus now, where directly there is the concentration of the quality or center of consciousness. But before that, the organs have also a special place here. And in the more material form of these ceremonial or occult practices, the physical organ is given great value. In the cow, and it sounds very strange when you look at it from the more physical mind, but if you look at it from the energetic side, it's obvious. In the cow, they map out the qualities of consciousness. Where in the cow do you have the most energetic quality of organizing to give nutrition? Well, the milk flow of the cow. But not just the milk. The entire excretory and milk generation organs are in one area, and the excretion of the cow dung is highly nourishing. It's antiseptic to certain bacteria which are bad to us, and which is probiotic to bacteria which are good for us. And so in the old system in India, rather than killing bacteria, they would spread positive bacteria which prevents negative bacteria that create illness. So they would mix a little bit of cow dung in water and sprinkle it on the soil, and they'll say, now we have purified the space. Now, if you think in modern English vocabulary, cow dung, cow shit, oh. But if you think in terms of energetic quality, you've just spread positive bacteria, probiotics is the vocabulary today. Well, you've actually created a space which is more healthy. But where is this generation of probiotic energy? In that same space? So the hind part of the cow is where the Lakshmi energy is most strongly imprinted. So there's even a ritual which is, you will still see it done in temples, where they want to worship Lakshmi. They will bring a cow there, they'll take this little lamp lit up with a flame, with whatever offerings, and then they will do this oblation and the turning of the lamp clockwise on the hind part of the cow, because that's where the Lakshmi presence is most materially grounded. What's in the head part of the cow? A completely different quality of energy, the sattvic energy of thought, of mind, corresponding to a different aspect. And there you would do a different kind of puja. If you think about your human body in this way, every center, every organ represents a particular aspect of the divine consciousness, or a particular quality of universal energy working, which again is mapped out in astrology by connecting different parts of the body to certain zodiac signs or certain planets. And it goes in sequence. The head is Aries. And what's the picture of Aries? Ram, who bangs his head against the wall and is not damaging his brain. Head is the strong part of the ram. Head. The second sign is face. Third sign, shoulders. Fourth sign, center of chest and heart function, particularly your emotional center, and so on, all the way down. Similarly, planets have certain corresponding centers. Now, all of this becomes obvious. And this is suggested in the very simple statement Sri Aurobindo makes here, that these powers, senses and capacities are connected with and impinge upon our physical organs. And here we understand why shifts in those universal, let's say, rhythms or those planetary alignments can actually have their effect on you energetically, but sometimes also physically, because there is a connection of a particular quality of consciousness. But that planet may have a connection because, well, that's your center of the chest is resonating with those things, but it is resonating much more with your feelings and your thoughts. And you can shift your state of emotions and thoughts to be immune to those influences. So let's say there's a tide, rhythms in the universe. And so we are now hitting monsoon season. There's going to be higher humidity. But does that mean all of your body should now be perspiring? Not necessary. By changing your internal condition, you can override those influences. So the question really, as far as we are concerned, is whatever may be the connections from outside, your state of mind and emotions has a higher influence. But this is where the link takes place from the mental and vital bodies to the physical. And so things hitting there can affect physical organs equally. And we saw the mapping top down. But then the second point of contact he has spoken of is the plexuses. And I think this we will take up in detail next time. The organs of our physical life and the plexus of our mentality. This is where the two things connect. We could go the other way. From the awareness here internally, we can open out to the awareness of those things in the subtle body. Your physical sight connects to the subtle sight. Well, make your physical sight more and more conscious and awaken in it the subtle sight. Your chest center connects to a particular level of consciousness of the vital or the mental body. Well, from here you open out and become conscious of those, or infuse in that a positive energy, and so on. So you can go the other way through these links, even as through those links influences come from there. But the plexuses are the most powerful in the sense that they are the point of direct energy flow through which all of this awareness of the subtle body, as distinct from the outer, are linked. We briefly touched upon it last time, Not only we saw the 6 plexuses within the body, 7th above, others also, but secondary plexuses and tertiary plexuses. So what you have is a picture, a complex picture of 3 bodies layered upon each other and tacked in through these link points of the different plexuses. And of course connecting to organs. And this is the picture he gives to us. I think we'll pause here and take up any questions. It's a very broad picture, very rich image we have developed. So, any comments or questions are welcome. Okay.
Can you briefly talk about plexus? Are they the same thing as chakras?
Yes, the plexus is chakra, but as we will discuss next time, there are secondary and tertiary centers also. And how exactly they connect and their role we will take in detail next time.
You said that the supramental body can harden at will and soften at will. I was just thinking in a very unconscious way, even we do that. I mean, fear will harden my belly, gratitude will soften it. Is it that we have to make this link more conscious? I mean, in us it's happening as a process of nature. In the supramental body it will probably be volitional.
Well, the operation of hardening and tensing rather is in us largely unconscious, and it's part of nature's organization at a material level. But in that, the tissue itself does not change substantially. It's the muscle tightens or loosens. Okay? But in the supramental body, the tissue itself will be different. You see, it's not just one substance becoming harder or softer by tensing. Its quality, it will express a quality of rigidity which will be of a different type, which was not there in the beginning. So it's not the same operation, there's a similarity.
I'm asking,
Yes.
can this principle in any way be accessed by us as we are right now in evolution?
Well, the one thing we can do in our physical body is become more and more conscious of it and all of its workings. But again, what you're doing right now is to become conscious with the power of your limited mind awareness. If you could become conscious of it by deeper mind awareness, already you could do so much more. This is what happens through many of the Hatha Yoga practices. If you could become conscious of the life energy working in it and of the life vital body and its connection with the physical body, you could do even more, because now you can modify biological processes by willing it with your mind. And again, that's one of the results of the pranayama processes in the Hatha Yoga. All of this still does not involve anything spiritual. If the spiritual consciousness can come in and begin to engage with it, it can do far more than you could with your mind and vital processes, and much more rapidly equally. And that would be the most direct, most rapid way for us. In fact, you will see in the very next sentence, which we will look at in detail next time, he says, by self-development we can become aware of them, that is these subtle bodies, subtle, mental and vital. We can become aware of them, possess our life in them. Right now we are only living in this body. We will be able to live equally in those bodies. Get through them into conscious relation with the life world and other worlds, and use them also for a more subtle experience and intimate knowledge of the truths, facts and happenings of even the material world itself. So, being aware in those subtler bodies, you will be able to not only engage with material things much more deeply, but even with your own physical body, you will be able to engage more deeply and richly. And none of this involves yet the spiritual consciousness. That's why he uses the word self-development. You train yourself, develop, and it's part of the human evolution still, which is undeveloped. There is then the spiritual evolution which is yet to fill into this. But if that begins now, that can do all this and much more directly and more rapidly. But the first step really is starting to become conscious of everything, not only our physical body, our life energies, emotions, thoughts, and everything deeper and higher that we can touch already. That's why you'll see in the sequence, by self-development we can become aware of them. That's the first step. From there we will possess our life in them. And then through that we will get to something more. But first becoming aware is your key. We'll look at this in detail next time.
That means that by bringing the psychic in the front, see, things start changing, and all
Yes.
these outer influences also they start decreasing. And that is said that being conscious, that is the only practice which leads to all the outer influences to get it out.
So, yes, certainly if the psychic influence comes forward, then it can do much more in awakening consciousness and aspiration in these parts. But otherwise, meanwhile, it's your mind and personal will which is beginning that process. But it's not the only thing. It's the first thing. And then, in that consciousness which is now developed, you open yourself to the divine influence by conscious aspiration, invocation. And when that influence fills, that is what is doing the transformation. The psychic influence prepares the base in which this turning of aspiration can grow. But it is the descent from above which will make the transformation itself of all these bodies.
This is a very basic question.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to ask you. You said you take any name, supposedly God's name, and develop a link with it.
Mm-hmm.
So many times we try to chant God's name, but it doesn't happen.
Yes.
And
Yes.
we need to do that, which we really want from
Yes.
from our heart.
It's a very important question. You may call from the heart the name of God. Doesn't always help. Sometimes it touches, sometimes not, mostly not. But notice, if you did the same thing in a different language or a different culture, you'd have a different name. Right? And that gives you the first clue, that it's not the name which matters. It is the idea to which you have given the name that is more important. So when you repeat the name, where is your concentration? Are you trying to pronounce the name correctly, or are you dwelling on the idea to which you gave this name? You see, that changes the whole game. Second, who or what part of you is dwelling on that which is behind the name? Is it only your mind dwelling in idea, or also your heart dwelling in love? And again, that changes everything. So the best way, most effective, if this is the path you're taking by dwelling on the name of the divine, first, don't concentrate on the name itself. Concentrate rather on that to whom you have given this name. And if it is Krishna, then in your mind conceive of Krishna as completely as possible, not just this historical biological form whose appearance you may or may not know, not just the image in which it is represented in your calendar, which may evoke something deeper in your heart, but yes, that's a focal point. But what does he represent in his immanence, filling the whole world? And the love that he brings into all things. Dwell in your idea on the full body and form and presence as much as you can. Maybe you can't go all the way, whatever you can. And then with it, your heart will begin to open to the divine presence and the love and the beauty and the sense of the sacred. And with your mind and heart thus opened, now you repeat the name, Krishna. And you see the difference it makes. So the name now becomes almost a nominal focal point, but your real dwelling is to something much deeper behind the name. The idea and the presence of which you have the idea. And very quickly you'll find it will deepen, and the name will become less important. The idea will be filled by the vividness of the presence, and it was only a skeleton on which, or a bowl in which the presence fills, and now even the idea has no meaning. There is the vivid experience and perception of the presence. Okay? So you must always go to the thing behind and focus there, and it's done much more quickly and more vividly. Mhm. You can feel it already. When we dwell upon it like this, already there's a sense of a glimpse, isn't it? In this one sentence that we have covered today, and last time also it was one sentence that we covered, you can see how much rich knowledge is held. And it is this very special capacity that Sri Aurobindo has to take a whole complex vision, experience, and articulate it in a single, sometimes complex, structured sentence. The elaboration of all these elements may be in other places, but the elements themselves are present right here in this formulation. So we will read this once again, and then we will close with a concentration of Om, and we continue this study next Friday. These, the vital and mental bodies, possess powers, senses, capacities, which are always secretly acting in us, are connected with and impinge upon our physical organs and the plexuses of our physical life and mentality. By self-development, we can become aware of them, possess our life in them, get through them into conscious relation with the life world and other worlds, and use them also for a more subtle experience and more intimate knowledge of even the material world itself. We can, by this self-development, live more or less fully on planes of our existence other than the material, which is now all in us, which is now all in all to us. And this is the direction we have to grow to as preparation for our spiritual life. We have not yet touched the spiritual life proper. So in the next paragraph after this, he will speak of the mental world, and after that of the spiritual. And really our focus is the spiritual, for which the vital and mental we have to become aware of, because they are the vehicles in which the spiritual has to enter and transform, equally as the physical.